love of fat. And the idea is there are different tissues, and the tissues in the body have different facilities for taking up fat or not. And this was based on an idea. Gustav von Bergmann, who was a leading German authority on clinical medicine and who coined this term lipophilia in this context, had a case in which there was a young girl that had a bad burn on the back of her hand. This is the late 19th century, and so they took a graft of skin from her stomach and they put it on the back of her hand, and then she grew up to be an obese adult. And she had a huge tuft of skin on the back of one hand, of fat, and none on the other. And von Bergmann said, this is fascinating. You can move the skin from the gut to the back of the hand, and it's whatever the characteristic is that makes it fill up with fat, that it goes with it when you move it. And this is what he considered lipophilia. So you consider, when we think of men and women fattening differently, men, their gut fat is lipophilic, and in women it's below the waist that their fat tissue is lipophilic, and you want to know what is regulating that. So this is German-Austrian hypothesis. Von Bergmann, as I said, was a leading German authority on internal medicine pre-World War II. The most prestigious award in the German Society of Internal Medicine is the Gustav von Bergmann Award. And then Julius Bauer, who was a leading pioneer in the field of endocrinology and genetics and chronic disease at the University of Vienna. He's still famous today in Austria. And this idea was more or less fully accepted in Europe by 1940, and then it vanished. Okay, here's how Bauer described it. He said, like a malignant tumor, like the fetus, the uterus, or the breast of a pregnant woman, the abnormal lipophilic tissue seizes on foodstuffs, even in the case of undernutrition. So if you think about it, even in the case of undernutrition, we can now begin to explain how you can have obese mothers with undernourished children. They're both undernourished, but just like a cancer, the fat tissue doesn't care. It maintains its stock. It may increase it independent of the requirements of the organism. Sort of anarchy exists. The adipose tissue lives for itself and does not fit into precisely regulated management of the whole organism. So you can look at animal models. There are dozens of ways to make obese animals these days: genetic strains, surgical strains. You can feed them different foods, and just ask the question, when I make this animal fat, does it get fat because I just make it eat too much and exercise too little, or do I make its fat tissue more lipophilic? And Jean Mayer was a leading U.S. nutritionist in the 1960s and 1970s. The School of Nutrition at Tufts is now the Jean Mayer School. He studied a strain of obese mice in the 1950s, and he said, these mice will make fat out of their food under the most unlikely circumstances, even when half starved. So they didn't get fat because they ate too much. They got fat if they ate at all. Okay? And in fact, there are mouse models of obesity that you can starve to death, and they will die with 4 or 5 times as much fat on their body as their lean litter mates that don't have whatever defect it is that makes them fat. And I would argue that at virtually every animal model I've ever come across, this is the case. The animals will at least get fatter, if not obese, even if you semi-starve them. So if obesity is sort of excess fat accumulation, what you want to ask is what regulates fat accumulation. And this is pretty simple. It's taught in medical school, doctors learn this, and then they're taught that it's not relevant to obesity. Which again, if you got a disorder of excess fat accumulation, you would think that the regulation of fat and fat cells would be relevant. But as I described in my books, in the 1970s, it was rendered irrelevant. And once you say it's all about energy in, energy out, you don't care about any of this. So this is a 5-minute class, and I'm kind of wrapping up. So fat is stored as triglycerides. This long molecule here is a fatty acid. And so you bind 3 fatty acids with the glycerol molecule, and you end up with this big thing called a triglyceride. So fatty acids are burned for fuel, and the fat enters and exits the fat cells as fatty acids. And then inside the fat cell, there's this cycling of fatty acids into triglycerides. So here's a fat cell. Here's a cell membrane. What's interesting is here's where we care about energy balance. Okay, if more energy in the form of fatty acids enters the fat cell than leaves it, this fat cell gets fatter. And if more energy leaves it than enters it, this fat cell gets leaner. So we're interested in the flux of fatty acids across the fat cell membrane and what regulates that. And so why do we transport fat as fatty acids across the membrane? It's because the fatty acids are small enough to get through the fat cell membrane. And then we bind them together with the glycerol molecule into a triglyceride, and we store fat as triglycerides because the triglycerides are too big to get out of the fat cell. So there are hormones on the cell membrane, enzymes that take triglycerides and lipoproteins, which is the form in which they get to the fat cell, and break the triglycerides into fatty acids. Then they flow across into the cell, and they're bound up into triglycerides. Then there are enzymes in the fat cell that break the triglyceride down into fatty acids. Okay, and what we want to know is what regulates all this, because if we know what regulates this, we probably get a pretty good idea of what causes that fat cell to store too much fat. Okay, that causes a sort of positive flux of fatty acids into the fat cell. This is where we care about energy balance. And so the answer was worked out in the early 1960s. And I said the theory vanished with World War II, but people continued to work on this. In 1956, 3 groups discovered ways to measure fatty acids in the bloodstream, and then in 1959-60, Rosalind Yalow and Solomon Burson discovered this radioimmunoassay which allows you to measure hormones for the first time ever in the bloodstream. Yalow eventually won the Nobel Prize for this. And this is a textbook, this is from 2010, but what they knew by 1965, insulin is a principal regulator of fat metabolism. And if you look at this 2010 textbook on metabolic regulation about fat storage and mobilization, it's insulin, 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 insulin. It controls everything. And if you want to get fat out of the fat cell, what you have to do is lower insulin levels. As Yalow and Burson put it, release of fatty acids from fat cells requires only the negative stimulus of insulin deficiency. If you get insulin levels low enough, fat will escape from the fat cells. And the insulin is also signaling the lean tissue whether or not to burn fat. So if insulin levels are elevated, the lean tissue will not burn fatty acids, but if you lower insulin, then they will. It's a beautiful system that was worked out, again, beginning in the 1920s, and by the mid-1960s, we pretty much understood it all. So just to show that it hasn't gone away, this is an Endocrinology and Integrated Approach. It's a 2001 textbook. You can get it PubMed online, Library of Medicine, and this is a photo of a young girl who was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes when she was 17 years old and gave herself insulin shots in the same 2 spots in her thighs for almost 50 years, and she got these huge fat masses on each thigh, and this photo was used to illustrate the action of insulin on the adiposity, which is the fat cell, which is to stimulate fat storage and inhibit mobilization. So you can make this assumption, just sort of first principles from basic biology, that we've been doing to our bodies kind of what she did to her thighs. Maybe wrong, but I would argue it should be the null hypothesis. So here are the key points of fat cell regulation. When insulin is secreted, a chronically elevated fat accumulates in the fat tissues. That's conventional wisdom. It's in the textbooks. And when insulin levels drop, fat escapes from the fat tissue and the fat depots shrink. That's also conventional wisdom, completely uncontroversial statement. And then we secrete insulin primarily in response to the carbohydrates in our diet, which is also uncontroversial. No one, well, 99.99999% of the people who study this would say that's the case. And so you end up with this idea that George Cahill, who was edited a textbook on this science in 1965, did some of the key work in the late 1950s, went on to be science director for the Howard Hughes Medical Institute. So he put it, carbohydrate is driving insulin, is driving fat. So that's conventional wisdom. That's textbook science. Now, if you remove the words is driving insulin from that sentence, you have the logical equivalent, carbohydrate is driving fat. And now you've gone from textbook science to the logical equivalent, which is quackery. Because now you're saying carbohydrates are fattening. Okay, this is Atkins' diet land. And in fact, when I lecture to medical schools, the doctors are all with me until I mention the word carbohydrates. And then they go like, oh my God, I thought this guy was intelligent, like thought-provoking, and he's a quack. Because he doesn't believe a calorie is a calorie. Anyway, just to show you that this is in the textbooks. This is Leninger's Principle of Biochemistry, probably the most well-respected biochemistry textbook in the country. I could have picked Williams' Endocrinology to say the same thing. So you look up adipocyte in the index, fat cell, and then you look to see what makes a fat cell fat, and it'll say high blood glucose, which you get from eating a carb-rich meal, elicits a release of insulin, which speeds the uptake of glucose by tissues, favors the storage of fuels while inhibiting fatty acid mobilization. So what makes a fat cell fat? It's carbohydrates driving insulin. What makes people fat? To a first approximation, obesity is a result of taking in more calories in the diet than are expended by the body's energy-consuming activities. This energy balance idea was so powerful, so compelling, so seemingly obvious, that we embraced it and decided that the biology of fat regulation was irrelevant to a disorder of excess fat accumulation. If you care about biology and physiology, then carbohydrates are fattening. Not eating too much, not sedentary behavior. These are the environmental triggers of obesity, and if they're the environmental trigger of obesity, they're the environmental triggers of diabetes also. But the way you get around it is by assuming this is just all about eating too much and exercising too little. So here's the alternative hypothesis. Like any growth defect, obesity is a hormonal regulatory disorder. So if you look in the textbooks, you talk to authorities, they break obesity down into hormonal disorders, which are like single gene defects. And then there's simple obesity, which is caused by overeating. And I'm saying, and the pre-World War II Europeans would have come to say, they're all hormonal regulatory defects of different types. So like type 2 diabetes, it's fundamentally a disorder of insulin signaling. Okay, and type 2 diabetes and obesity are so intimately associated that many people call them diabesity. They're the same, two sides of the same disease, and we're saying they are. Okay, they're both insulin signaling disorders, and it's triggered by the carbohydrate content of the diet. Okay, so not all carbs, obviously. Well, not obviously, but not all carbs. The two that we would expect to be the most fattening would be the high glycemic index carbs that drive blood sugar. Okay, bread, cereal, rice, and pasta, the base of the food guide pyramid, coincidentally. Remember, we wanted to explain the obesity epidemic. These are the foods that we all came to believe were inherently heart-healthy diet foods. And then sweets, anything with sugar, because sugar is half fructose. And high fructose corn syrup is 55% fructose, and it appears that fructose might cause a condition called insulin resistance, which would then make us over-secrete insulin to all these other foods. So here's the alternative hypothesis. Refined grain starches and sugars stimulate excess insulin secretion, which stimulates excess fat accumulation, obesity, and the obesity epidemic. And you can ask the question, should this be surprising? And the conventional wisdom from the 1820s to the 1960s were that carbohydrates were fattening. This is what my mother grew up believing. This is my favorite sentence. This was the first sentence of a British Journal of Nutrition article written by one of the leading British authorities, one of the two leading British dietitians. And what's interesting is in the 1980s, when we started to decide that fat caused heart disease, we had to tell the whole public to eat carbohydrates. It's actually a British report that says we have to get the American public, we have to get the British public to eat less carbohydrates. We're going to have to figure out how we're going to do that since we've been telling them for the past 20 years they were fattening. What's interesting is if you look at for diets for obesity in the literature, which I did, I found 4 of them published from medical schools in the U.S. in the late 1940s, early 1950s. Harvard Medical School, Stanford Medical School, Cornell Medical School, and Northwestern. Okay, these are not small 2-bit schools, and they were all identical to this one published in the Practice of Endocrinology, which was the seminal British endocrinology textbook. Raymond Green was a leading British endocrinologist. He was the brother of Graham Greene, the author. So this is what they were. So they had foods to be avoided. It's a food guide pyramid plus sweets. And you can eat as much as you like of the following foods: meat, fish, birds, all green vegetables, eggs, cheese, fruit, except bananas and grapes. Okay, so what's interesting, you can eat as much as you like of these foods. This was before they even understood the role insulin played in fat accumulation. You can eat these foods because they're not fattening. You can eat these foods because they are. It's not about how much you eat. It's just these foods have this property of being fattening, and these foods don't. And with the exception of some of the fruit, this is the Atkins diet. And this was a diet that was recommended to treat obesity by some of the best medical schools in the country. And then we decided that these foods are heart-healthy diet foods. And sugar, for a variety of reasons, kind of became harmless, in part because the sugar industry worked like hell to make it look like that, and because we decided that dietary fat and saturated fat were the cause of everything. Evil. Okay, last slide. What happens if you actually remove these foods from the diet? Okay, so let's say you're now practicing physicians, health practitioners, you've got an obese patient, you want to tell them what to do. So what you're going to do, according to this physiology, biology, endocrinology, is say, look, don't eat these carbohydrates and replace them with fat. Because if you replace them with fat, fat is the one nutrient that doesn't stimulate insulin secretion. So basically, you're now recommending the Atkins diet. So over the past decade, there have been a lot of studies of this diet. I got into this because in 2001, I was reporting a story for the New York Times Magazine, and I found the first 5 of these studies that were published, and they are pretty much unambiguous, okay? If you remove the carbohydrates from the diet and replace it with fat, in clinical trials, you get a decrease in body weight, body mass index, abdominal circumference, systolic blood pressure, diastolic blood pressure, plasma triglycerides, fasting glucose, glycerol, hemoglobin, plasma insulin, C-reactive protein, a measure of inflammation, as well as an increase in high-density lipoprotein, cholesterol, aka the good cholesterol. Everything gets better. All markers of heart disease and diabetes, risk factors, get better when you merely remove the carbohydrates from the diet and replace it with fat. The problem is captured in this last sentence. So the low-carbohydrate diet was shown to have favorable effects on body weight and major cardiovascular risk factors. However, the effects on long-term health are unknown. The effects on long-term health were unknown in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s when we told the American public to eat a low-fat diet. Okay, in fact, when the first government report came out on that, the president of the National Academy of Science testified in Congress that he believed we were putting the whole United States population as experimental subjects on a diet that we didn't know what it was going to do, and since then we've had obesity and diabetes epidemics. Yeah, the effects on long-term health are unknown. That is indeed true. But the best experimental evidence we have is that every risk factor for disease gets better when you remove the carbohydrates from the diet and replace it with fat, even saturated fat from animal products. If that wasn't true, I would have written a different book, and I wouldn't be here today. Anyway, that's it. I never know how to end these lectures. I should have a slide that says thank you. Great one. I'm happy to answer questions for another 47 minutes. Then I have to catch a plane. But thank you for your patience. And there must be questions because I hope that I provoke some thought. You can eat bacon, yes. A lot of people who buy into this end up wearing T-shirts touting the universal goodness of bacon. Good for everything but the pig. Yeah, one thing is, I'm a little hard of hearing, so you have to speak up.
I know you touched on genetics and thinking about the rolled up phase, but I've been hearing so much more about epigenetics and how that plays a role, and I want to hear your thoughts on that.
Okay, I mean, it's interesting. So just addressing genetics first. There's obviously a genetic component to this. I think it's the genes are responding. Basically, they're responding to how tolerant you are to the carbohydrate content of the diet. And there are a lot of other hormones involved with fattening as the sexual differences will tell you. So estrogen in women, testosterone in men. The epigenetics is interesting because when a woman gets pregnant and if the evidence shows if she's obese, diabetic, gestationally diabetic, if she gains a lot of weight during pregnancy, these are all conditions in which she will become even more insulin resistant than she is. And the fetus sees blood sugar in relationship to the blood sugar in the mother. So the idea is that the fetus would then develop, the pancreas would evolve, you could think of it, in a higher blood sugar environment and will develop more insulin secreting cells to deal with that blood sugar environment that it sees from the mother. So the epigenetic changes would thinking of it this way, would basically create a fetus that is going to over-secrete insulin in response to the carbohydrates it sees once it's born. And mothers in all these conditions tend to give birth to bigger and fatter babies. And actually, there's evidence that babies have been coming out of the womb fatter that goes along with the epidemic. So one possibility, actually, to explain the epidemic, and this was voiced as a possibility to explain the diabetes rates in the Pima, is that with each subsequent generation, you give birth to more and more infants that are predisposed to get fatter in a carb-rich environment. And in fact, you can replicate this in animal models. And the animal models are really bizarre because you could manipulate either the insulin levels in the mother or the blood sugar levels. There are even experiments that allow you to change the macronutrient composition of the mother's milk when the animals are weaning. And you could create animals that could appear to be completely normal until they hit middle age. And then they manifest metabolic syndrome, obesity, diabetes, and if they're female, they will then pass that on to their pups with pregnancy. So you can imagine each generation, you create more and more children, infants, pups that are more susceptible to the carbohydrate content of the diet. And that alone could explain some part of the obesity epidemic. And we just hit some trigger point. Again, I have young children, and I deal with a lot of people who have young kids, and I'm always stunned, like, were kids in the 60s as carb-obsessed as children in this generation? Because I have friend after friend after friends whose kids will eat nothing but carbohydrates. And I don't know, maybe it was beaten out of us and we didn't have a choice when I was growing up back in the 60s, but it's conceivable that this is actually a kind of epigenetic intrauterine effect that is now makes it even harder for each successive generation to reverse the problem.
Can you contrast your position with Dr. Lustig's position on fructose and sugars?
Yeah, so Rob Lustig is a UCSF pediatric endocrinologist who has been arguing that sugar is the fundamental cause of obesity, diabetes. Can you guys hear me without this? Let's see what happens. You should be able to. There's got to be a way to open this. So, actually, Rob Lustig and I believe very similar. And Rob has helped inform me. Rob believes that sugar is the only problem. He originally believed that sugar, so that sucrose and high fructose corn syrup are the fundamental problems, the triggers, the cause of obesity and diabetes, and that anyone will be healthier. That the key to a healthy diet is to remove the sugars, and then you can keep the glucose from starch, and you'll be fine. And I've been arguing that it's both. That the starch in the refined grains are bad, and I'm even willing to accept that the refined grains are bad because of the gluten content, which is another argument, or the effect on gut microbiome. What I now believe, one of the things you have to explain, like one question you should ask me is, well, what about Southeast Asia? Right? Here's a whole population of people who eat nothing but high-carb diets, and they don't have obesity, they didn't have obesity, they didn't have diabetes. How can you explain that? And in fact, historically, I'll be okay. Historically, the Japanese were always used as, first in the 1930s, as an argument against sugar causing diabetes by Elliot Jocelyn, who was a leading American authority on diabetes, and there's the Jocelyn Diabetes Center at Harvard. Jocelyn said, look, it can't be sugar. Look at the Japanese. They live on carbs. Jocelyn didn't understand that sugar, sucrose, was different from rice. That one breaks down to glucose, the other breaks down to glucose and fructose. And then in the 1960s, Ansel Keys said, look, carbs can't be fattening, they can't cause heart disease. Look at the Japanese, they don't have heart disease. The point is the Japanese never ate sugar either. So this is one of the main reasons why I now think that sugar is necessary to create this sort of insulin resistance, disturbances in insulin signaling, and then once you have a significant amount of sugar in the diet, and I don't know what significant amount is or means actually, then all these other carbohydrates become fattening. Because you have populations that eat high-carb diets that are lean, no diabetes, very little heart disease, live to be 80, and you have populations that eat high carbohydrate diets that have these monstrous obesity epidemics. And the question is, one way to look at it is maybe it's not the carbohydrates. That's what Jocelyn and Keyes would have argued. And what I'm arguing, and what Rob Lustig would now argue, even if he wasn't 5 years ago, and we've informed each other's positions, is that the sugar is the trigger. And then once you've got the sugar in the diet, then these other carbohydrates become bad. It's even conceivable that the gluten issue, weirdly enough, is triggered by sugar. There's a researcher at the University of Colorado named Rick Johnson who's been studying the enzyme that breaks down fructose. It's called fructose kinase. And there's evidence, he's got evidence that this could be, fructose kinase is expressed in your gut, and this could cause the leaky gut that allows gluten to get into the bloodstream and cause whatever problems it causes. And a lot of the science is speculative. There's no way to really judge how right or wrong it is. But what we're hoping is we will get more and more people studying it. More and more people are studying it now. So it's becoming more and more sort of conventional wisdom, this acceptance that sugars and refined grains are problematic is becoming sort of standard operating procedure. The question is now, how much people accept the idea that saturated fat will not kill them. Yes.
So what about the paleo craze these days?
Paleo is another variation of carb restriction. So a lot of these all have